Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Laura Egan. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Senior Director of Programs here at Clery Center. And I'm joined by my colleague, Abby.
Hi, everyone. My name is Abby Boyer. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Associate Executive Director here at Clery Center.
So, we're here today because a few weeks ago we held our quarterly member question and answer call, which is designed to be an opportunity for any Clery Center member to hop on to a live call and get their technical assistance questions answered. And our April call happened to be scheduled a few days after the Title IX regulations release. So it was a perfect time for us to share some information to a large group of folks about things to keep in mind as they were reviewing the regulations and what those pieces meant really for integrating the Clery Act into policy and procedure. And we received a couple of really great questions from folks attending that benefited from that answer in real time. And we wanted to create a resource for a broader audience that people could come back to time and again to review and reference as you continue to make those changes throughout the next couple of months in anticipation of that August 1st implementation date for the new Title IX regulations. So here we are with another question and answer session that'll just be Abby and I today. But, we hope it's another great resource that you have in your toolbox as you continue to internalize the Title IX regulations. And today we will focus on some of those key intersection points between the Clery Act and Title IX. We like to say that the Clery Act is like forever the bridesmaid to Title IX's bride. So we look for opportunities to shine a light on the Clery Act and bring it into relevance with Title IX. And with these, new regulations coming out, there really are a couple of areas that we wanted to stress the importance of and the impact that could result once policies and procedures are in place and response actions start having to take place as well. So let's get started. I will be kind of going back and forth asking some questions and then responding to them. So I'm just going to ask Abby our first question here today, which is just generally, Abby, can you overall explain how the Clery Act is connected to Title IX?
Yes, that's a big question because there's a lot of intersections there, but Title IX is connected to the Clery Act in three major ways that we'll focus on during this conversation. One is the way that it defines sex discrimination, specifically sexual harassment. So the connection between what's reported under Clery and what's considered to be sexual harassment under Title IX. A big piece is who is required to report under both laws, under Clery and under Title IX, and what behaviors fall under that reporting. And really a third piece, but a big piece, is what's captured in a policy or disciplinary procedures. And we're specifically today going to talk about that role of an advisor of choice, because some of you might remember we had a lot of opinions about that during the last regulations. So we want to share some of what has shifted under these regulations. So I'm going to give that one right back to you. Let's start with a basic question. When is an institution obligated to respond to reports of sex discrimination under Title IX?
Ooh, great question. And this is one of the more significant changes in these 2024 regulations from the 2020 regulations. So now the language that campuses really should be referring to is that a recipient, so a recipient of federal funds, which means an institution of higher education, or institutions that are K-12, but it's a little bit out of our lane, so we're just going to focus on higher ed today, but a recipient with knowledge of conduct that reasonably may constitute sex discrimination in its education program or activity must respond promptly and effectively. So that is certainly a little bit broader set of obligations to respond to than the prior regulations. And that can be helpful because it widens the net for what things would have to get actioned. But it also can be challenging because that might cause a lot more folks to have to consider whether or not they are aware of information that they should be passing along. And it just could cause more scrutiny more frequently for reports that come through, which is just, more action steps overall. But, if the purpose or the main goal is to make sure that instances of sex discrimination are being appropriately documented and responded to in the way that centers the needs or desires of that survivor and to the best of its ability protects the needs of the community, that's what we're hoping for, is achieving that balance there. So, as we start to think about reporting information, Abby, it would be really helpful if you could describe who is required to report instances of sex discrimination under Title IX, and how does that information overlap with Clery Act requirements for campus security authorities?
Sure. Well, as the Clery Center, I feel like we always start from the place of what does Clery say and then how does Title IX intersect. So I'll do a quick recap of that. So those of us who are living in Clery all the time know that under the Clery Act, we have what are known as campus security authorities. And campus security authorities is the terminology used for anyone who's required to report under the Clery Act, and they fit four definitions. One is campus police and security. The second is anyone with a security function. So that could be someone like a resident assistant or an access monitor. Anyone who's written into campus policy as someone to whom members of the community should make crime reports. But then the last one, which is the broadest category typically, would be those individuals or officials that have significant responsibility for student and campus activities. So those are our folks who have to report under Clery. The new regulations broaden who are required to report under Title IX. So you might remember the last regulations really focused on this phrase called officials with authority to institute corrective measures. So if those officials with authority or the Title IX coordinator knew of information, that is essentially what put the campus into motion as to how they responded to sexual harassment. We still see that officials with authority terminology within these new regulations, but we also see them now including reporting for people who have responsibility for administrative leadership, teaching, or advising, as long as they're not a confidential employee. And we'll talk a bit about what confidential employees are as well. So anyone who fits under those categories, again, administrative leadership, teaching, or advising, so that's probably a lot of folks on your campus, they're going to be responsible for reporting to the Title IX coordinator. All other employees who don't fit that definition, so that could be, for example, individuals who are working within your cafe or cafeteria, they might not fit those definitions, then the campus has the option to either require them to notify the Title IX coordinator if they learn of specific types of incidents, or to provide the information, the contact information for the Title IX coordinator and how to make a complaint. So we'll be unpacking that a lot further, certainly in trainings that we'll be providing. But for now, we'd encourage you to think about the intersection of your campus security authorities with individuals who are now required to report under Title IX. And one piece of that will also be making sure that you really understand then who is confidential. So since I'm talking so much about confidential, this could be a good opportunity to really think about that. So Laura, if you wouldn't mind just sharing a little bit more about what do these regulations put in place around confidential employees and how does that intersect with the CSA piece?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for re-summarizing all that information about CSAs, Abby, and how it kind of does overlap or remind us of now this new consideration under who is required to report under Title IX. But yes, like you mentioned, confidential employees under Title IX are now referenced as this broader definition of roles that are not required to report under Title IX. And so these new regulations state that employees whose communications are privileged or confidential under state or federal law, or employees the institution designates as confidential for the purpose of providing services to persons related to sex discrimination, and employees who are conducting an institutional review board approved human subjects research study designed to gather information about sex discrimination, all of those are roles that would be considered confidential for Title IX purposes, meaning they are not required to report information they learn about sex discrimination to the Title IX coordinator. However, this group of individuals could involve roles that are currently identified as campus security authorities. So it would be important to first review who is on your list of CSAs, reevaluate if they still meet the definition of one of the 4 categories of being a CSA, and then determine if they also meet the criteria for being one of these confidential roles, or if they are now considered confidential for Title IX purposes, I should say. And then you would want to evaluate how you are going to talk about the distinctions that role holds from being confidential versus being a campus security authority. This is going to be challenging for administrators to understand and interpret, let alone communicate outwardly to your campus community. So I was likening this earlier to similar to how people think about even timely warnings and emergency notification. If there's ever an opportunity to just re-inform what a campus security authority is and what a Title IX confidential employee is, and when and how those roles intersect or what their ultimate responsibilities could be, this is a great time to think about some of those small micro social norming campaigns that will probably be very needed in the coming months to roll out, probably more than once. And then just in general, reminding folks about the responsibilities of a campus security authority and what they are required to report and when and to whom. But I guess overall, what I'd want to answer to your question, Abby, is, this is new. This is new in Title IX regulations to affirm that these roles with privilege would be considered confidential under Title IX, and that the institution has the ability to designate other roles that, for the purposes of providing sex discrimination response or services, are also considered confidential. So this is going to be an area of continued learning and growth as that is applied to policies and procedures, and also reflect campus security authority responsibilities. So thank you for asking that. So as we're thinking about roles that have these obligations to report, it's probably good to refresh our memories with what constitutes sex discrimination under Title IX. And just to clarify, is any of that different now from the regulations in 2020?
Yes, and here's where I try not to nerd out and explain this as simply as possible. So if we remember, the 2020 regulations really explicitly aligned Title IX and Clery Act reporting. They referred back to Clery Act definitions for dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. The current regulations still have 2 definitions of sex-based harassment that don't explicitly connect to Clery, but are still important to know and understand. One is quid pro quo harassment. So the employee or member of the institution requiring or, explicitly or in an implied way conditioning the provision of their service, so that class or grade or some sort of benefit from the institution on a person's participation in unwelcome sexual conduct. So pretty much the standard understanding of what quid pro quo means. There's also this definition of hostile environment. So that's unwelcome sex-based conduct that, based on the totality of the circumstances, is subjectively and objectively offensive and is so severe or pervasive that it limits or denies a person's ability to participate in or benefit from that education program or activity. So you'll notice there are some changes there. We're not going to dive deep in that because we want to focus on the intersections, but know there are a lot of great free resources from other organizations that have been spending a lot of time just on that definition. The third definition is what does most intersect with the Clery Act, in that it names dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking as sex-based harassment. This does, for the most part, align with the Clery Act statute, but it doesn't align with the Clery Act regulations for sexual assault. So I just want to unpack that a little bit. So the Title IX regulations say that sexual assault means an offense classified as forcible or non-forcible, this is their language, not our language, forcible or non-forcible sex offense under the Uniform Crime Reporting System of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. So what that's referring to is the FBI's National Incident-Based Reporting System. And that system divides sexual assault into basically 6 different offenses: rape, sodomy, sexual assault with an object, fondling, incest, and statutory rape. Now, those of you who are familiar with the Clery Act regulations, you probably recognize that the Clery Act regulations don't use that same language or those same definitions. They updated their definitions to include a more inclusive definition of rape that was coming from the summary reporting system under uniform crime reporting. And that captured assault of the vagina and anus and assaults with body parts, objects, and oral penetration all in one comprehensive definition, and really importantly, recognizing all of those as acts of rape. So we really are a fan of that shift in the regulations. But the thing that's important to understand now is that even though the Title IX definitions, therefore, in your policy, will likely not perfectly align with what you're reporting in your statistics, at least in terms of terminology, they are all capturing the same behaviors. So we're kind of getting into a place where we were more in our history of the intersection between Title IX and the Clery Act, where there'll be some terminology differences in what's reported in Clery Act crime statistics and within your policies, but the actual behaviors that are reflected in both of those places would remain the same. So hopefully that makes some sense. Certainly we'll explore that more in some of the trainings that we're providing over the coming months, but that's a good starting point just to understand where you might see some differences in language there.
And Abby, before we move on to our next question, I just wanted to tack on one quick thing to that as well that we have been talking about. And it's just remembering that Title IX is using that language of sex-based, and the Clery Act is not considering or thinking only about sex-based stalking or sex-based domestic violence. Certainly, I think the argument can be made that most instances of sexual assault or dating violence are likely going to be predicated on sex-based harassment in some way. But there are instances, depending on your definition of domestic violence, because there is a part of the domestic violence definition that points to local jurisdiction, and there are aspects of stalking that are not always sex-based. So when you are thinking about writing your policies and procedures, if you are lifting the definitions directly from the Title IX regulations, you are going to be slightly narrowing your policy terms from what Clery defines. So you would just need to think about, do we want to only be talking about sex-based stalking in this policy? And we'll have a separate policy for addressing non-sex-based stalking? Or do we want to make sure that this is a policy that addresses sex-based stalking and non-sex-based stalking to incorporate the Clery definition there?
Yes,
So
yes.
just wanted to make, I know it's like a little bit more nitty gritty, but I just wanted to make sure we highlighted that because it's so connected to definitions.
Agreed. And I think that's also the perfect segue, because what I'm thinking about is that really ties to how are we planning out these policies? What are they going to look like? And what's going to change about our policies from maybe what they look like right now? And we started touching on some of these other areas earlier, like the jurisdiction of Title IX, the advisor of choice role. So can you just give us kind of a quick summary of some of those areas and how they might shift because of this intersection that we're now seeing between Title IX and the Clery Act?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one other area where Clery Center had a lot of concern from the 2020 Title IX regulations was this strict application of jurisdiction for Title IX, where it was only concerned with behaviors that occurred within education programs or activities occurring within the United States. And we recognized why that was the case, but that was limiting in some ways because of how the Clery Act thinks about geography and the implications for actions that maybe happen, outside of the contiguous United States, but that still can have an impact on your campus community and the obligations that the Clery Act has about when information is provided in response to reports of dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. So thankfully, the 2024 Title IX regulations have a broader application since it does specifically name that campuses are responsible for addressing incidents, even if some conduct contributing to the hostile environment that's been created within the education program or activity in the United States occurred outside the education program or activity outside of the United States. So campuses that moved to a bifurcated process for incidents that occurred outside of the Title IX scope of education program or activity in the United States might now be reconsidering merging into a single policy again, because again, the obligation to address a hostile environment in your education program or activity in the United States is still applicable, even if some of the conduct causing that hostile environment has occurred outside of the United States or outside of an education program or activity. So clarifying that obligation is really helpful and hopefully will give campuses a little bit more freedom to merge policies or go back to one policy and multiple procedures that feel a little bit more streamlined and easy to understand for a campus community, especially when so many individuals in your campus community might hold multiple roles, like being a student and an employee. So all of those things, anything you can do to streamline that policy or process would be helpful for some of these considerations. And then, it's just important to remember that the disciplinary process itself might change because institutions still may, but are not required to conduct a live hearing. And for those that do conduct a live hearing, they could have the parties ask questions through the advisor of choice as previously required, or now through the decision maker. So those of you that are familiar with our previous positions know that we are particularly excited about that change and do not recommend putting the advisor of choice role in a position where they must conduct that questioning. We really are more appreciative of the option for that to be the case, or for questions to go through another role or the decision maker directly, so that we are preserving the original intention of that advisor of choice role as it was established under the Clery Act.
Great. So all of this was still very high level. So if you are part of those roles that are really diving into what should these policy changes look like on your campus, we'd encourage you to join our trainings on our website. They're called Policy Synergy, Title IX, and the Clery Act. And we'll be spending our time really looking at how do we develop policies that are in alignment with both of these laws. So you can find out more information on our website at www.clerycenter.org. And for our members, remember to keep on asking technical assistance through the member portal. We know that this is going to be a really primary area for your focus over the next couple of months, and we're here to support you. So thank you for joining us for this particular session together, and we look forward to supporting you as you put these new regulations in place.